I hope you won't take it as a dangerous portent that we're expected to have a blizzard tomorrow. This has nothing to do with the last case of the S&W course. As you see today, we're using a slightly different format. We're going to have a panel discussion for about 40 minutes and then open the entire session up to questions from the audience. The topic today is retrospect and prospect, and we're thinking about how to apply the strategic theory and practice that we've studied in the last 11 weeks to our current and projected future security threats in the international system. With me on the panel are, as you know, I'm Professor Hoyt, Professor Lane, also Professor Douglas, and Professor Holmes will be here shortly. The topics today that we'll be looking at are theaters where we're currently engaged in conflict: South Asia, the Middle East and Persian Gulf, and then the broader war against al-Qaeda and transnational terrorist groups. And then Professor Holmes will discuss the pivot to Asia. The idea, again, is to look both at the current theaters we're in and what trends are in those theaters, and what we might expect in the future in terms of policy guidance and policy focus. For those of you who don't know South Asia, this is South Asia. It's basically the area around the former Indian Empire. It focuses on the Indian subcontinent. It includes the states of India, Pakistan, Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and the Maldive Islands. It also may include Burma, depending on how it's defined. This is an area that's complex for the United States government in terms of institutions. It is dealt with differently by the Department of Defense, which splits this region at the Indo-Pakistani border between PACOM and CENTCOM. The State Department, however, encompasses the entire region and includes Central Asia. So this makes creating and coordinating policy complicated and difficult. It's also an area where the US has not historically had a lot of contact, and the contact that we've had has often been unproductive, unfortunately. There was almost no contact between the US and this part of the world before 1940. In fact, in 1940, in the US Census, there are over 100,000 people of Japanese descent who live in the United States. There are over 75,000 people of Chinese descent who live in the United States. There are only 4,000 people from the Indian subcontinent who live in the United States. Most of them are Sikhs. Most of them are farmers. Most of them live around Berkeley, California. So to say that the United States had close cultural contact with India before 1940 would be a big exaggeration. In fact, it was brand new for us, and when we began engaging India in the early 1940s, all that most people knew about the subcontinent was what they had read in Rudyard Kipling and the movie Gunga Din, almost literally. So in the aftermath of the Second World War, where the United States becomes a global player, this is a part of the world where we have very little familiarity, we have very little confidence, and we have very little experience. That created a very poor security dynamic for us and for the region. The United States viewed its relationships with states in the region primarily in the context of the Cold War and the relationship with the Soviet Union. That immediately caused a problem. India did not wish to be involved in the Cold War. It chose a policy of non-alignment, which at some times the United States actually interpreted as actively hostile. Pakistan, on the other hand, was glad to ally with against the Soviet Union with the United States, first in the Central Treaty Organization and later in the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. This created the beginning of a long and difficult relationship between the US and Pakistan, which has been based primarily around security needs. When the United States needs something from Pakistan, we create a close relationship. When that need goes away, we have a tendency of abandoning them. The Pakistanis are very aware of this. This is a key element of their foreign policy. And when they look at the future right now, they see the United States withdrawing from Afghanistan and potentially withdrawing again from the region, which affects their policy towards us and towards their other neighbors. A key element in this region has been concerns about nuclear proliferation. India tested nuclear weapons in 1974, and in 1998, both states did multiple tests of nuclear weapons. The current projections are that both states have close to or perhaps more than 100 nuclear weapons. Pakistan is building nuclear weapons faster than any country on the planet at this point. So the proliferation of nuclear weapons and nuclear technology, both within the region and outside the region, remains a concern for the United States. However, our relationships changed in some fundamental ways after 9/11. We have perversely become closer in some ways to both India and Pakistan during the war on terror. And that is perplexed, it is complicated, and it makes maintaining and improving the relationships more difficult. As we think about possible conflict in the region, it's worth going back to some of the tools that we use in strategy and policy. And in this case, I've just taken a very simple take on the idea of the three blocks of war. The wars that are global and have potential global consequences, what might cause them and how they may affect the international system. The second, the regional wars between competing local powers, wars over territory and influence. And then the third block, internal wars and the rise of conflicts over religion, ethnicity, and nationalism. In terms of the Block 1 wars, which are the ones we're most concerned about, the most obvious potential cause for a Block 1 war would be the emergence of both India and China as very powerful military and economic states. A fundamental shift in the international system that is part of the reason that many analysts talk about the world tilting towards Asia today. You now have two emerging powers with massive economies, significant potential to continue to increase the size of their economies and to interact with the global system, and each has a population of over 1 billion people. This is very new and very different. Now, India's development is lagging about 15 years behind China's, but it is still very impressive. It has a record since 1990 of annual growth of between 6 and 9% each year, and it is now becoming a major player in international markets. However, both China and India have a border dispute. They do not agree on their borders in India's north, in the regions around Tibet, Arunachal Pradesh and Aksai Chin. They've actually fought a war over these borders in 1962, and they had a major crisis that almost led to war in 1986 and 1987. So these are not necessarily status quo powers. There is potential for conflict. A third element here in the problems that might lead to war in the region is that both have a different relationship with the United States. China's is becoming much tenser, and India's is becoming much closer, which contributes to tension in the US-China relationship. So there's an interesting triangle building here that may again complicate international security. And last but not least, China depends on energy being shipped across the Indian Ocean. That energy comes around the coast of India. Now, even if India is benign, and it says it is benign, and it has acted in benign ways, that can become a security concern for China if other elements in the international system are creating a crisis. We are now seeing the emergence of China in the Indian Ocean for the first time. Professors Holmes and Yoshihara will talk about this later and have written on it copiously. So that is a potential arena for conflict in the future, and it's one that's very different for the United States. We have not thought about major power naval rivalry for a considerable time, and that's part of what this case is designed to get us re-engaging. There are nuclear powers in the region as well, not only India and Pakistan, but also China, and emerging on the periphery of the region, Iran, a major concern for the United States. There's also a traditional intervention role for both Russia and the United States in security problems in this region. Last but not least, there are some emerging new transnational problems. The most familiar is transnational terrorism. We see increasing radicalization in the region, and South Asia has become the hub of Islamist militancy in the world. That has been abetted by significant state support, particularly from Pakistan, for the use of militant and separatist groups in carrying out their foreign policy and their policy against their regional neighbors. It raises questions of nuclear security, especially within Pakistan, but also to some extent inside India. There are also some other broader non-traditional security threats. Again, disruption in the global economy could occur if there's a massive economic crisis in either India or China that could have global effects. Humanitarian disasters have unfortunately been a hallmark of the region in the last 10 years. And there's increasing possibility for significant humanitarian disaster in the region because of demographic trends with very, very high population growth rates, especially in Pakistan, but also with water resources, which are declining and which are monopolized because the major rivers in Asia all flow out of the Chinese highlands. So there are non-traditional elements that might again lead to political conflict that could be a great power war. Very quickly, in terms of regional conflict, the one that we're most worried about and have been for decades is a continuation of the conflict between India and Pakistan. This again comes as the result of unresolved border disputes, but it also comes as a result of very different national images. Pakistan was created as a home for Muslims. India defines itself as a secular state and has the third largest Muslim population of any country in the world, which it appears to have integrated fairly well into its society. These conflicting views of the world contribute to political and military conflict. There have been 4 wars between India and Pakistan. In the last 30 years, there have been 5 nuclear crises. Some of them are involved in terrorism as well, particularly the 2000 attack by Jaish-e-Mohammed and Lashkar-e-Taiba on the Indian parliament in Delhi, and then the 2008 Mumbai terrorist attack, which was so well publicized and well covered that we could watch it during our Thanksgiving break. It was on the news 24/7. In addition, there are unresolved border disputes between Afghanistan and Pakistan, which will complicate our decision to withdraw and the future of Afghanistan. Those remain a problem. Afghanistan does not recognize the Durand Line, although every other state in the world does. And that creates a potential conflict between those states. Last but not least, we do see increasing issues and increasing possibilities of regional conflict based around Iran, which Professor Lane will talk about in just a moment. Last but not least, internal conflicts, which is something we tend to underemphasize, but need to look at very carefully in South Asia. There is now a Naxalite rebellion, which is present in 30% of India's districts. India has identified this as the greatest single threat to Indian security, greater than China or Pakistan. It's based around conflicts of caste, of economic distribution, of class, and of languages. We also see ethnic problems elsewhere in the world. Sri Lanka, the Tamil population remains unintegrated into society, and the current regime, having crushed the LTTE, appears not to be taking further steps to reform the role of Tamils, even though they are a minority population, which raises the possibility, again, of ethnic separatist movements rising based on the Tamil population. Bangladesh, we see the rise of Islamist militants. In India, again, we also see the rise of indigenous Islamist militants. In Afghanistan, we see large numbers of Taliban, of course, and other groups, which for the most part have gone from Pakistan into Afghanistan. But now we are seeing a reverse phenomenon where for the first time we have verified reports of groups in Afghanistan attacking back into Pakistan and attacking elements of the state and the security forces there. So that is becoming a cross-border conflict based around not only Islamist militancy, but also Pashtun ethnicity. And in Pakistan, for the first time, their green books this year, the writings of their general staff, identified the internal threat to Pakistan as the greatest threat to Pakistan's security, for the first time finding something that surpassed their fear of India. As a result, when we look at South Asia, we see lots of potential causes for war. We can begin to use strategy and policy tools to think about what those causes might be and what those wars might begin to look like, and what the appropriate role of the United States would be in the region. With that, I'll pass on to Professor Lane, who will talk about the other major region where we're in conflict or have been engaged in conflict right now, which is the Middle East and the Persian Gulf.
Good morning. I was given the sort of tasking of talking about the Arab Spring, Syria, and Iran, and I was trying to give some thought to how to wrap that all together in a package. And I decided that the best way to wrap that in a package is to try to give you an argument that holds it all together. So I'm going to talk to you about my perspective on the Arab Spring, a little bit about how it affects Syria, and then we'll complete the discussion with a little discussion about Iran. Now, having said that, there's a lot that I have to leave out. So I hope that during the Q&A period we can raise specific issues, because the details have to be subordinate to the overall argument here. The retrospect and prospect case allows you to think back over a long period of time. And one of the questions that I think, at least in the context of the Arab Spring, and some of you may call it Arab revolutions, there are lots of terms out there. One of the questions is, when did the revolutions begin and why did they come now? And I think that most of the answers to that, I heard one on the radio on the way in, was they began with Tunisia, they began with Egypt. I think this is actually false, and I think it's retrospect that helps us look back at our cases, look back at the historical trends that some of you had in your cases, and see that there may be some other arguments to be made there. So the first argument that I would make, and these are factors contributing to the Arab Spring, is that the Arab Spring itself
Press the right button.
the right.
Right button.
The Arab Spring itself began in some cases at the time these countries were founded. You can see up on the screen there are the independent states. In other cases, they began after. But I would place the Arab Spring as at least 25 to 30 years old in its gestation. That this has been going on at least, at its very latest, since about the time of the first Gulf War that we were involved in Kuwait, when we went to the Gulf to restore the sovereignty of Kuwait. And this Arab Spring is the process of failed reform programs and failed liberalization over 25 years. So I would place it there, and we can talk about why that is. The key point here is that it's not the success or the failure of Arab Spring from the time of the early 1990s or late 1980s that's so important, but the fact that the talk about reform and the expectation that eventually governments in the region will be moving to something other than what they were before, in a sort of leaning towards democracy, is part of the public discourse. And it is part of the public discourse for more than a quarter of a century now. The public discourse that was part of you could call it the Arab Street in the 1990s, became part of our foreign policy discourse in 2003. And that foreign policy discourse, as some of you explored in your case yesterday, included two foreign policy goals. One having to do with the war on terror, which Professor Douglas will talk about, and one having to do with democratization of the region. So we embraced this by 2003, and the way that it was viewed in most of the region was either with disdain because people felt that they had already embraced the idea and they didn't need to be told this by the US, but also because it was not welcome as a policy that should be imposed from the outside. That is, democracy cannot be imposed by the outside. So the slide here depicts a cartoon with that kind of expression, that democracy is being forced onto the Arab world by the US. A second factor that I think pushed along what we are now calling the Arab Spring has to do with the evolution of satellite television. And I personally find a lot of explanatory power in this issue, and that is that the existence of media or free media before 1996 was mainly state-based in the different countries in the region, and it was definitely not very transparent media. Al Jazeera changed that, for better or for worse, from 1996 onward, and within a decade, less than a decade, have the lion's share of the viewing market. They have the lion's share of legitimacy on the market, and they have been evolving the way that they represent the news in that 15 years. The key point here is that all of the things that were happening or not happening, and I would stress the latter, in the area of reform, in the area of government liberalization, were magnified through the lens of satellite television. And the point here is that a more open media market exacerbated the expectations that already existed, so that when Al Jazeera showed what was happening in other parts of the world, that began to filter into the attitudes and the narratives of what would become now what we're calling the Arab Spring. The third point has to do with the response to that, and actually to do with 9/11 and the last 10 years that we've been involved more directly through the lens of the global war on terror. In the last 10 years, the countries in the region have invested very heavily, as have we, in counterterrorism and in counterinsurgency programs, sector security reform, one might call it. And this securitization has taken place against the backdrop of a train that was moving toward the process of reform, and in many cases now has caused those countries to stop that train and even reverse it on the tracks. So for us, counterterrorism is mainly an external foreign policy issue. For any of the countries of the region, counterterrorism is a domestic issue. And it's a domestic issue that has implications at the level of the ministries of interior, in the foreign ministries, and in all of the institutions of the state. So the point here is that counterterrorism as a national narrative has eclipsed, for almost all of the countries in the region, what was previously maybe not an ongoing and productive process, but it has eclipsed a narrative that was about reform. So post 9/11, countries in the region have more often been interested in securing themselves rather than reforming themselves. And this has caused a backup on that Arab Spring train. So what are the prospects? Oops. What strategic and long-term considerations should we be making as Americans as the future unfolds in the region? This is the prospect part. Well, let's just take the Clausewitzian triangle because it provides some good ways of looking at this. There's a military issue, a democracy issue, and a violent conflict issue, each stemming from the sides of the Trinity. The military issue, and here I go back again to Retrospect. Military issue is that we don't know much about the specific religious, ethnic, and political currents in the militaries of the region. What we know is war by algebra. We know basically what they look like in hardware, and we know basically about how they have evolved within the state as an institution that has kept the state sovereignty or kept the state secure from its internal enemies. But what we don't know is how the attitudes of the Arab Spring have affected the attitudes of the personnel of those militaries. And Greg Goss, who's a Middle East scholar, pointed this out very well in a Foreign Affairs article in the July-August issue in 2011, stating that this was true. If this is true of most of the countries that are engaged now in the Arab Spring, this is certainly true of other countries, and it shouldn't be forgotten that right now there's been a reversal in attitudes about the role of the military that links directly with Clausewitz, which is the military in traditional political science and in the view of Clausewitz should be subordinate to the civilian part of the triangle, to the government. And now the trend is to view the military as the savior of that political element, and in some cases, as is the case this morning, there are calls to create a military transition that places the military in the role of both government and guarantors of the state security. The second issue is a democracy issue, and it has to do with that political side of the triangle. Now, the way that most of the reform has been negotiated throughout the last 25 years has been very heavily dependent on what I would call referendum politics. Now, referendum politics, if you want to use Clausewitz to say war is a continuation of politics by other means, referendums, like wars, have been used to continue politics by other means too, especially when politics are absent. Since referendums represent a form of a direct democracy or direct vote, they're often used in the region when political process is absent or is stagnant. And they've been used in two different ways. They've either been used to affirm the legitimacy of the state, for example, by having a referendum to extend the term of a president for another 7 years or another term, for example, by being used to suspend the Constitution or add articles to the Constitution that have to do with securing the state. And they've been used in ways that do not have to do with furthering the democratic process in the country. In fact, they've been used in a reverse. And they have been used in ways that do exact opposite of what a referendum should possibly do. And I'll point out there are two places between here and, well, the Middle East. There are two places that there's never been a referendum. We do not have federal referendums, and Iran has never had a federal referendum. Almost all the other states in the region have held referendums at one time or another in order to bolster the regime's legitimacy when the legitimacy on the popular end does not exist. The third issue is a foreign policy issue. A violent conflict issue. And here again, the past is instructive. When you look at the future for Lebanon, for Yemen, for Syria, what you should bear in mind is not the past of these countries necessarily, but look to the past of countries that have been involved in civil wars and have not been able to come out of them for a very lengthy period, like Lebanon. The line between loyalist and rebel tends to change overnight, and when it changes, it's usually a result of mass bloodshed. And I'm going to read you a statement that is a quote having to do with Syria, and it says, "Responsible public statements as to what shall be done with Syria are conspicuously lacking. There are few official references, however, although somewhat vague and unsatisfactory, amateurs and journalists speak, but premiers and ministers are silent. Answerable heads of state deem it wiser to say as little as possible, but the mob has already settled the fate of Syria 100 times over." And this is written by a Syrian observer in 1917 about the state of Syria in 1917. And if you had interest in the rest of the article, it talks about the other powers looking into the region but not being able to affect its tenure. The last point that I'll make, and I guess we'll finish on that, is a foreign policy issue that is directly related to us. States that are in transition require more in terms of resources, not less. We've established a transitions desk through the Department of State. We've established programs which are meant to help facilitate change in the region, but the problem of dealing on an institutional level with multiple centers of power is one that we will probably have to face for the next 25 years. That there is no good formula within our institutions to handle multiple states evolving in the same geographic area at once. And so it's going to be an institutional and a government foreign policy issue to handle those things all at once. Two final points on Iran. And then lends itself to a great quote that I've heard over and over in the department, came from MacArthur originally, never get involved in a land war in Asia. Since we are involved already in a land war in Asia, or involved at the level we are, it's probably, that's the first part of the prospect. But in the retrospect position, the lack of reform in Iran led to the Islamic Revolution. That's the first point. So the stalled liberalization in Iran led to its revolution in 1979. Second point has to do with the Iranian military. The Iranian military did not stand by the Shah when that revolution took place. It took the side of the opposition, and in the end defected to that opposition and became the enforcer of the state. Third point is that the Arab Spring came to Iran, or you could say Iran had its own Arab Spring or own revolution in 2009, and that is just underway again, and that was called the Green Revolution. And we will see how it evolves from here, but in about 4 months there'll be a presidential election which will help us understand whether Iran is going to seek to extend the power of the president, or whether Iran will go ahead and have another regular election on its own domestic front. On that, I'm way over. Thank you.
Well, good morning. I'd like to begin by reiterating something that I think you've heard a couple of times, which is you're not involved in a history course. You're involved in a strategy course, which by definition is an applied history course. I think what we've tried to do is to give you a set of mental tools to look at a complex set of issues, take the best evidence available, and then exercise your judgment on where to go next, to develop courses of action to match policy to strategy. And we're giving you one more tool this week, the Retrospect and Prospect tool, borrowing from Mahan, quite explicitly looking back, but then trying to take the same thing to project forward, standing on the cusp, if you will, of the transition between history and strategy. So I'm not going to hold back this morning. I will deliver my judgment, but I want to emphasize that for a reason. There is a spectrum of disagreement whenever there is a realm of judgment. I'm probably on the more optimistic end of the faculty when it comes to the GWAT, and I may well be on the more optimistic end of the population now in this room. But that's what the question and answer, or I think more aptly labeled discussion section, should be about. But first, let me lay out where I stand. And to give you the bumper sticker, I believe it's halfway won. And I'll end with explaining exactly what that means to me in terms of metrics, what I'm expecting going forward. But first, let me start with the retrospect part. In kind of doing honor to that framework, I think you can go back and pick up a tool that you had before with Clausewitz from the very first time you got here, week one. And that quote that's well familiar to you now about the first, the supreme, most far-reaching act of judgment, well, I think it's worth rereading now, because if you haven't already come to this realization, it will probably seem astoundingly obvious in hindsight. That line that I've highlighted at the end is the critical one to consider. Yes, it's important to get the nature of your war right when you're starting it, but natures of war shift while you're fighting it, while you're interacting with the adversary. So it's important to continually reassess what the nature of the war is and adapt to it. And I think that's the best way of reading that line that I have highlighted there at the end, that this is the first of all strategic questions and the most comprehensive. I think it's first of all in order of importance, not first of all as in you do it at the beginning. It's the first question that you have to work through, and then once your checklist is done, you can move on. It remains the first of all questions. In doing that, I think you can look back at the evidence that you had in this last case. If you think of your Barfield reading on Afghanistan, the sweep of political evolution there, if you think of your Justasi book, which dealt more with a operational picture of how things have evolved, yes, it's complex, but I think the first thing you can do is realize that it's not the same. Things we may label Afghanistan on the offhand or the Taliban are not the same as they were in 2001 when that case started. And looking back on it from this pivot point at the end of that case, I think the first thing I'd emphasize is there's a fundamental difference when you're confronting the neo-Taliban that I find a lot of value in Justasi's argument that you had for the last seminar and set of readings. But I think it's also important to look at this is we went back to the same AO, or we stayed in the same AO and surged more forces there, but the actual arena of conflict shifted. It overlaps with Afghanistan, but to me it's very much an AFPAC a second Afghan war, if you will, than one long continuous Afghan war. So I see one war kind of organically 2001 to 2002 with a consolidation period, and then a new war beginning very much in the same area but overlapping with the Pakistani theater as well from 2005 forward. And that's the one I think we mean when we say Afghanistan now. What's interesting about that is al-Qaeda had a choice too, and I think in their anxiety to come up with a new front and get out from underneath the problem that Zarqawi was presenting them by taking their brand name in a certain direction in Iraq, they also reconfigured. They looked for new hosts, they looked for ways to be more successful, to lend strength to the neo-Taliban, but also to pick particular new partners like the Haqqani network and elsewhere. They also began to declare war, literally, Zawahiri declaring jihad on Musharraf after the Red Mosque incident inside of Pakistan itself. So a lot of their strategic communications have been focused on reshaping their foot soldiers' image of where the arena of conflict is, from just Afghanistan with the Americans to this larger area. But in that space between what I would call the first and second Afghan wars, some interesting things happened. NATO expanded in what I think they quite honestly thought was a peacekeeping role, a stability role, a reconstruction role at the time. And they pushed, as they should have, good governance on the Afghan state. The problem was a state like that is most vulnerable at the moment that it's reforming. And it just so happened at the moment that it's reforming, that is when the neo-Taliban was able to reconstitute. And they didn't come from the borders. They actually re-infiltrated and came back from the inside, back from the rural lands, but most particularly the narco nexus, where they came from the opium fields of Helmand. They were able to capture that profit, that infrastructure, and then literally roll down north to south from the center of the country and present the Afghan government with a problem it was unable to confront on its own. And that turned NATO stability ops into a harder war. So what we did about it was what I would call the second Afghan war. But even here, I think it's misleading if you allow labels like the surge to explain what we did. It's a very different surge in my mind. It's a surge to reset to the way things were circa 2004, not a surge to resurrect our fortunes and rebuild an entirely new order like we did in Iraq. If that were the case, I think we would have kept forces in theater longer, had more of them, and rolled from the south to the east. My overall take on the surge in Afghanistan was we reset stability in the south, never did that plus up and roll to the east, but we rebuilt Afghan security forces and are hoping that they'll withstand the test the second time around. We've already announced our withdrawal in 2014, but that withdrawal began in 2011. So there's a long trajectory going there, and we've already declared victory, which presents some interesting issues I'll get into in a second. But in between those two periods, two very interesting things happened, right? The bin Laden raid and the Arab Spring, which is still incomplete, rolling from Tunisia to Syria. Which brings me to the prospect, where to go from here. So instead of offering an older theorist, I offer you a new one, in this case Lawrence Friedman, commenting on what he calls the transformation of strategic affairs. And what I offer you here is my take on how words actually hurt an adversary. It isn't public affairs, it isn't strategic communication. For me, it's not actions speaking for themselves, it's words that hurt in the sense of weaving violent action into a narrative that makes a story real and palpable and believable to your adversary and to other audiences and to your own audience. That you're essentially trying to tell a story through your actions that is a better story than the other side is trying to tell. You're setting out goals and then living up to them, which is a little different than letting your actions speak for themselves as silent professionals or merely trying to shout down your adversary with a better message. So how do we do that? Well, I think it's part of, with that in mind, how can we design our operations with an eye to creating a narrative? I think the key factors are how are we going to consolidate that second Afghan war? First, there are a couple of things that are severe challenges. There's an Afghan national security force infrastructure that the government of Afghanistan can't afford. My response to that is good. They're a sovereign state, and they're going to do a lot of things that sovereign states need to do in order to build their state, such as telling us no on a whole number of things. However, because it's a critical theater to us, we need to have influence over where that goes. We need to be able to assure our minimum criteria of no safe havens, the ability to continue targeted soft operations, and so forth. If Afghanistan could afford its own security forces, we would be in a world of hurt. Because they can't, we still have influence even as they reconstitute and become sovereign. It's not that we can tell them what to do, but we can at least enjoin them to have a discussion with us over what we should do together. They also have a core that they can defend now. I think that's the virtue of the surge to reset, is we probably, in my mind, slightly overpurchased the amount of territory they can defend, but that's good. That gives them a chance to come up to speed, and I think there is a core that quite literally will hold. There are areas that will be lost, but I think the most important part is we'll be able to sustain them on the other side of that tipping point and buy time for the Afghan state to begin to digest the big challenge ahead of it and slowly dissolve its opposition. We also have open negotiations with them about what our promise to support them through 2024 means. We've said substantial support, but that will be defined by many things along the road, including whether or not Karzai tries to run for office a third time in defiance of the Constitution, or whether he lets himself be bound by the Constitution of Afghanistan, and we have a successful transition to civilian power, or continuance of civilian power, and a peaceful regime change. I also think it's important to think about the way we've designed our operations inside of Afghanistan. Unlike others, I don't think we've abandoned our idealism and defined down our expectations. I think we've simply got more realistic about how we're going to achieve them in an indirect fashion. I look at the urban centers like Kandahar, Lashkar-Gah, Kabul, etc., as reverse sanctuaries, areas where we are able to promote our idealism, our full span of things we would like to see happen, including women's rights, education, etc. But we're not doing that across the board in Afghanistan because that simply solidifies the enemy coalition too much. But we haven't given up on them either. So we create an area where they can coexist and by demonstration begin to bring along the rest of Afghanistan by persuasion. But there are several challenges to this halfway one idea that I have. The first is the Haqqani problem. That's a shorthand label for a much bigger problem. And what I look at is if you surge to reset, but mostly in the south, that leaves the east of Afghanistan as unfinished business. Some people talk about one neo-Taliban. I think very much in terms of a south and an eastern Taliban, a coalition within a coalition that may be able to be fractured, particularly if Mullah Omar is removed. And with that, there are other allies of that eastern faction that are not allies, I'd say, of the southern faction, and the Haqqani group in particular. They're also a particular problem because they have their own ideology, their own motive power, and it may be the new host that al-Qaeda may be able to transition to if abandoned by the Taliban, if the Taliban do in fact join in with the negotiations we've advertised that are going to begin in Doha. We also have the sovereignty problem. Bear in mind, we've already declared victory for 2014. That has several unique aspects that come with that. Already, Karzai, in speaking side by side with President Obama, is stressing Afghan sovereignty and that they own the prisons now and the full cycle of detention and that they will take the lead. We can expect them to press that demand more and more, that we respect their sovereignty, as we can expect the government of Pakistan to press the idea of its sovereignty more and more. Now that we've declared victory in the Afghan theater, it lessens our claim on the ability to continuously conduct drone operations across the border. But that same mechanism holds true with our own population. We have what I'd call the Al-Awlaki problem. In 2001, we took out a terrorist target with a drone strike in Yemen and killed an American as a collateral damage incident. It passed utterly without remark. We did so again very recently against al-Awlaki, killed an American as collateral damage, not as the primary intended target, and it aroused an ACLU lawsuit. Perhaps rightly so. Perhaps not. We'll let that play out in the domestic arena. But my main point is the social context in which we prefaced our previous 10 years is changing underneath our feet, and we must change with it, not rail against it. And that also brings up a few more problems. The price tag problem. You're all aware of the financial difficulties we're facing here in the States. But unless we can make an explicit and considered argument for picking up the price tag for Afghan national security forces and elsewhere, we will lose that leverage because we failed to articulate the importance of keeping it. Which brings me to two final problems. At the same time, we have a franchise problem. It is not just about consolidating in the AFPAC theater. Al-Qaeda is wisely choosing to go wherever it can, targets of opportunity to extend its franchise to Mali, to elsewhere, some directly in its name, some elsewhere. But we should not expect them to simply put up a final fight and die in the AFPAC border. They will do everything they can to adapt just like we will. We have to overmatch them in terms of adaptation, which means we must continually pay attention to new areas. And then we have the elections problem. There are things that are out of our control. Many people may think that the most important election problem we face is who will the Egyptian people choose? Will they choose a Muslim Brotherhood president, or what will happen for future elections in Libya, or would an election in Yemen bring someone contrary to our national interest to power? What will happen to a free Syria? Will the extremists win if they're the ones that bought freedom for the Syrian people? But my response to that is that's not the elections problem I'm worried about. I am more worried that Karzai will not feel bound by the Afghan constitution. And then by not going through a legitimate Afghan election, one that's seen as legitimate by the Afghan people, it may shatter our ability to consolidate our second Afghan war. I'm also secondarily concerned about whether or not Iraq will continue to make its transition. I think there's very good chances that they will successfully hold another round of elections next year and continue that peaceful transition to power. But it is one that we must closely watch and encourage to go according to proper procedures. Which brings me to a theme that you probably picked up from me when I talked about the 1990 to 1998 period. The problem with it is the same problem we had with 1991 to 98 in containing Iraq. It's fundamentally too long a period, halfway one, meaning we have another decade of war ahead of us, for us to treat this as war termination, as all we have to do is cash out our military gains and find out how to declare victory. It's a war we still need to fight to a long consolidating finish for 10 years. It's too long for war termination, which means if you take another decade of war, it will demand equal levels of national and strategic attention that it has for the last 10 years. The difference will not be in the level of attention we need to bring to it, but in the level of resources that we'll be putting against it. We'll need to fight it somewhere on the order of half to a third of what we've been doing for the last 10 years. But that may already be a higher benchmark than people have in the fronts of their mind if they're thinking of this as a war termination problem, not a war continuation problem for another decade. And with that, I'll rest with my argument that we're halfway there with a lot of challenges ahead of us, but with considerable opportunity, and pass it to my colleague.
Beware of metaphors. I will argue to you this morning that metaphors are invaluable. We use them to pass on meaning. They convey a lot of meaning in very few words, but at the same time they can mislead, particularly if taken especially literally. And I think the idea of a pivot to Asia is one of those metaphors that has been taken too literally over the past 18 odd months since Secretary Clinton outlined the idea of a pivot to Asia in Foreign Policy magazine. Now, as I started setting up this presentation, I did the obvious thing that we all do, and I went to the internet and started looking at pictures of pivots. I come from an engineering background, and so I gravitated to the ones that look like they come out of engineering systems. Can't quite identify this one, but I believe it might be a strainer. But you get the idea. You get the idea from this picture that a pivot is something that happens around a central axle or shaft. It looks like here you would attach a handle to this and you would shift this piece of gear from one side to the other. It's very much an either or black or white, or perhaps even a zero-sum message that this pivot is passing to me, at least. Or you can look at another. Or you can look at another very familiar piece of equipment to the mariners in the audience. This is an engine order telegraph. This is what people on the bridge use to ring up various bells and tell the engineering plant what they want to do. So I think a pivot might also say something about the speed and the scale at which some transition happens. This is kind of an interesting pivot here because you can see the lever over on the right-hand side has ordered up all back full, but yet the engines are not answering at all. So perhaps that implies about something about the speed at which bureaucratic apparatuses respond to commands from above. So these are some of the things that I think that the pivot connotes to audiences if you don't really break down that metaphor and think about it. And in fact, I would compare it to the Eye of Sauron, which we're all familiar with from the Lord of the Rings. Sauron, sitting over in Mordor in his nice tower, he can see everything, but he can only look at one direction at a time. I think that's another thing that we get out of the pivot. That you can only look at one direction at a time. When that pivot swivels around, it does so radically. This implies that the United States is shifting resources radically from one theater to the other, and that it's doing so rather rapidly. I'll make the case to you this morning that none of these things is especially true. If we do take the pivot as a literal construct, there must be a pivot point. And I think and I've lost count, both here at the college and reading commentary in the wider world, of how many people who have opposed the pivot because it means the United States must by necessity be turning its back on other important regions, usually Europe. If that's the case, then I think this is probably the pivot point right here, Washington, D.C. The United States has traditionally, as we've seen in the course this term, has traditionally thought in Europe first terms. It's looked eastward across the Atlantic to that most important theater. And I think that oversimplifies. I will argue to you that, and here's graphically what I just said. The United States looks to Europe as a primary object, a primary theater in which it tries to keep a hegemon from establishing control of that vital rimland, and thereby constituting a threat to the Western Hemisphere. And you can see that I placed the pivot right on Washington, as I just said. So, and this would be the idea of the pivot. If the United States is indeed turning its back on this valuable theater and looking towards Asia, towards Western Pacific, and towards the Indian Ocean region, then it must be turning around, looking to the west from Washington, D.C. And I think that, again, I think this obscures. As you all know, the United States, once the Panama Canal is built in particular, we're about to celebrate its centennial, it clearly looks to the south, to the Caribbean, and to that outlet to the west as well. So I think this does obscure meaning. And plus, here's another simple metaphor for the pivot. Pivots don't necessarily mean turning your back on one thing. Here's a nice band gradually pivoting around a central point and just sort of pointing in a different direction and doing so at a leisurely pace. I think this conveys a little bit more about what the shift that U.S. foreign policy and strategy are undergoing than the idea of an either-or pivot to Asia conveys. I would say that the difference is not so much that the United States is pivoting from the Atlantic and Europe to Asia as it's pivoting from Europe as a primary theater of operations to the Indian Ocean. If you look at Europe today, I find it hard to find any real threats in the Atlantic theater or on the continent of Europe. Therefore, the United States is essentially swiveling its attention around to the Indian Ocean, which, judging from our maritime strategy, last year's defense strategic guidance and other documents, is one of the two main theaters for U.S. maritime endeavor. I think this is what the idea of rebalancing, the more current term that we're using for this process, conveys. Rebalance from safe theaters to more critical and more endangered theaters. So to return to this idea of America's strategic gaze, here's how I think it shaped up before the pivot. The United States was gazing at Europe as a primary theater, at the rimland there. It was gazing at the eastern rimland of East Asia, primarily China and the offshore islands. But post-pivot, it's really not that much different, is it? The United States, if it's going to surge forces from the continental United States into the Western Indian Ocean, is still going to do it from the East Coast simply because it's the closest to the region, particularly the Western Indian Ocean, Arabian Sea, and all of those things. So the United States will continue to look eastward, but in a sense it will look past Europe. It will look at the Mediterranean Sea, the choke points that lead into the Western Indian Ocean, and it will think about Europe in a sense as an enabler rather than as a theater of primary endeavor. So this is very much a shift of emphasis rather than turning our backs on anybody else in the world. And I would argue that this is a shift that has a long pedigree. Many, if not most of you, have gone and waged war in South Asia. You're quite familiar with the idea of Europe as a platform for doing so, for logistical purposes and getting material into the theater and so forth. Or you can look at it in a slightly different way. My teaching partner yesterday, he suggested that the United States, as it pivots to Asia, it's actually hugging the world, or it's actually hugging Eurasia more specifically. And in a sense, when you look down from the pole, that's almost true, isn't it? Forces reaching out from the west coast, forces reaching out to the east coast, and essentially enveloping all of the Eurasian rimlands, giving a more comprehensive view to U.S. foreign policy. But again, looking past Europe and treating that as a platform for making this all go. I would argue too that if the United States needs to pivot to Asia, that it needs to pivot to somewhere. It needs to establish a more central position in the region. Professor Yoshihara, who will speak to you in a few minutes, and I have been arguing for a couple of years now that Australia is a great central position and a great focus for the pivot, simply because it lies at the seam between the two key theaters, between South Asia and between East Asia. Forces can swing from side to side within the region as circumstances warrant. I guess how the diplomacy of this will all play out, the Australians do not want to choose between the United States and China for obvious reasons and for very understandable reasons. Nonetheless, I think this should be a major priority for Washington as we move ahead with this pivot. Just a couple of closing remarks as we look at the map again. As the pivot unfolds, the United States strategy in Asia, and in Eurasia more specifically, will take on a more vertical cast than it has in the past. This and also the polar map that I showed you a minute ago come out of Nicholas Spikeman's book, The Geography of the Peace, a wonderful book published in 1943 during the Second World War. Spikeman was a professor down at Yale. I like this map because it shows during the Second World War how the United States essentially was projecting power horizontally from the West Coast to East Asia, from the East Coast to over to Europe. If the United States pivots into the region, however, and particularly if it does proceed with a basing plan in Australia, you can see that it will be looking northward more and more. This will become particularly true if climate scientists have it right, and if the rimlands along that northern tier are ice-free for a month or more each year in the coming decades, because that will open up an entirely new rimland and perhaps a new theater for the United States to pivot to. Excuse me. And just my last point I would make to you is that the idea of a sudden shift, a sudden pivot of major resources is misleading in the extreme. This is very much a slow motion pivot, which is why I called up another picture of an EOT, engine order telegraph, that it shows it's all ahead slow. What you're actually looking at is not a sudden shift or abrupt shift of resources into these regions, but about 20 ships, many of them lighter craft, many of them new construction, into the region over the next 7 to 8 years. This is not a stimulus that should elicit a major response from the region, which could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing. I would make the case that the United States should pivot more resources more speedily into the region. So let me close. I've attacked the idea of a pivot, the metaphor of a pivot, or at least I've tried to break it down for you a little bit. If the pivot is a bit misleading, then what would I define a pivot as? I would define it rather simply as strategic mass, the ability to maneuver strategic mass into key theaters in relatively short order, overcoming the tyranny of distance and other geographic features, while also taking into account the key determinant, which would be the ability of a regional adversary to oppose that pivot, to oppose that strategic maneuver into the region. These are all things that we've encountered over and over again in the course of this term. The ideas of interaction, the physical setting, mass, dispersal, all of these things that Clausewitz and our other theorists have talked about. And there's actually one other theorist who I would also close with. One of the greatest of all theorists, President Lincoln, who wrote eloquently about concentrating diplomatic and military efforts in time. Get it done at the same time, or certainly in rapid sequence. Lincoln was thinking about mounting offensives simultaneously along the Confederate periphery to overcome Confederate defenses. But nonetheless, I think the idea that you need to concentrate your efforts in time if you want to send a powerful diplomatic signal, let alone to be ready for actual military action, is one that applies across the board. So we can always close with our favorite president, who was actually quite a strategist in his own right. And that's about all I got for you. I guess we'll open up for Q&A. Pass it back to Tom.